Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to another Redline Spaces. This one focusing on drone doctrines. We got three amazing speakers joining us today. First up is Samuel Bendett, an adjunct senior fellow in the Technology and National Security Program at CNA, specializing in research on Russian defense and technology developments, particularly in unmanned and autonomous military systems, and is one of the key experts in this field. Also joining us is Tom Mutch, who is a fantastic frontline journalist who's been covering the war in Ukraine for a number of years now and has just released an incredible book that I really enjoyed. And last is Candace Rondeaux, who's a senior director for Future Frontlines and Planetary Politics, who's not only a professor in practice at Arizona State, but she's also a globally recognized expert on international affairs, US national security, irregular warfare, and the strategic use of organized violence. She also has a great book out called Putin's Sledgehammer. So great panel. I'm going to throw to Sam for this first one. I remember us talking about this years ago, but particularly since 2022, drones have become the be-all, end-all of the modern battlefield. With over 90 countries and even non-state groups operating these today, how has the rapid proliferation of these unmanned systems changed military grand strategy?
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to discuss this topic, and I welcome my fellow panelists. I think what you are talking about are several very specific developments. The war in Ukraine has shown that the threshold to acquiring different types of UAVs have been significantly lowered, not just for wealthy countries, but also for any military, including non-state actors. In Ukraine combat, there are a lot of drones made from commercial components, a lot of repurposed commercial UAVs are now fighting on both sides. There are developments that lower the cost for manufacturing and using different types of UAVs, including long-range UAVs that used to be out of reach for all but a handful of countries. And so there are a lot of militaries now looking at Ukraine combat and trying to determine exactly what they need and how they need it. Another significant aspect related to it is that this technology is spreading, and the knowledge about using different types of UAVs. We're witnessing conflicts around the world, from Latin America to Africa to Middle East to Southeast Asia, that has very significant echoes of Ukraine combat with respect to the types of technologies used and how they're utilized. And then finally, with so many UAVs in the air at any given time in Ukraine, the battlefield has become extremely dangerous for soldiers, for any groups or any gatherings of forces, weapons, or systems viewed by overhead intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance UAVs. Those UAVs can track any potential target, be it a single soldier or a single vehicle, and then those targets can be very quickly attacked. It's not that the battlefield is fully transparent. There are still opportunities for advancements and surprises. The more ISR, the more Overwatch UAVs there are at any given point over a specific area, the more difficult it is for forces to move. Doctrines related to ground forces have to be modified and adapted to the availability of these assets that can be very cheap and very plentiful.
So, Tom, you've been in Ukraine covering this conflict since the very first days. You were there during Russia's opening strikes. The drones being used in Ukraine, their doctrines have changed. Things are very different to how they were during 2022. Can you take us through what you've seen on the battlefield and what's different now to back then?
One of the things I think is interesting to note is that drone warfare in Ukraine did not at all start from the official military-industrial complex of the Ukrainian armed forces or the Ukrainian state. By far the most common usage of drone warfare early in the war was hobbyists, right? The famous early one, I think a lot of people will remember seeing that huge Russian column in the northeast of Kiev. There was a street full of Russian tanks and armored vehicles that had been annihilated by Ukrainian artillery. A hobbyist wedding photographer happened to have a drone and decided to scout the battlefield with it basically of their own volition, and saw this column sort of idling around, gave the locations to Ukrainian artillery, which were able to wipe it out in one go. It was quick to see that drones could have extraordinary use on the battlefield. Basically, after you had people using drones to scout, people pretty quickly realized that you could strap a bomb on them and fly them over. Drone warfare became essential at the end of 2023, because that was when the Ukrainian counteroffensive had failed. The US Congress had instituted a 6-month pause in the aid provisions. And basically, the Ukrainians began to run almost completely out of artillery ammunition. And this was a real problem for them. They had to adapt and think on the fly. They found they could import components for drones, whether that was Mavics, the larger agricultural drones called Vampirs. The Russians know them as the Baba Yaga drones, which are some of Ukraine's best units. Even FPV drones, which cost maybe $500 to put together. Now people are getting close to being able to put them together for $100.
So, Candace, what I love about your work is you have covered quite a lot of theatres in the world that are uncovered. And whilst there's so much coverage of Ukraine and Israel and Gaza on how drones are being used, you've done a lot of coverage on how these things have been used in places like Africa by both governments and private operators as well. So can you take us through a bit of what is different about how these things are being used in these secondary theatres?
Yeah, thank you, Michael, and thanks for having me on again. It's great to be back and talking with you and with your audience. The thing to note about outside the Ukrainian theater, which of course has been just tremendous in terms of revolutionary and military affairs when it comes to drones, Africa has been a place of a lot of experimentation. Since 2011, there have been about 900 drone strikes accounted for. This is from a study put out recently by the African Strategic Studies Institute here in Washington. It's remarkable to think about where we were in 2011 at the peak of the Arab Spring, the beginning of the turmoil in Libya is an important focal point, largely in the context of Russian operations there and the Wagner Group, which I've studied for many years. You might remember that in 2019, there was this fantastically catastrophic offensive led by the Libyan National Army in concert with Wagner Group on Tripoli. It was the Battle for Tripoli. What was significant there, it was their first time really encountering drones, strategic drones at scale. So this is where Turkey deployed Bayraktar's TB2s to combat the offensive and really blew back the Russians continually. The Russians had had quadricopters and had been using them in Syria for many years, so it wasn't new, but they did not have the kind of strategic level strike capacity that their opponents did. It was a very costly lesson that ultimately saw a real shift that I think we're starting to see play out in places where the Wagner Group has been extremely active with their partners in Libya, in Sudan, in Mali. And you might remember last year there was a number of skirmishes between Wagner forces and their partners in Mali and local rebel forces that ultimately resulted in an exchange of drone strikes in remote parts of Mali that were quite deadly. So what we've seen is a new learning curve for Russia's partners in Africa. One of the things that's going to be very interesting to see is the ways in which Russia's own production capacity and its cooperation with Iran on the production of Shahed drones has resulted in Chinese copies, the Sunflower 200 being the most infamous, that are now showing up all over Africa. And I expect actually that kind of production capacity also will have an effect on the learning curve of use of drones outside of the Ukrainian theater.
So, Sam, I'm going to throw this question to you. I've long said that most battles are won with explosives, but most wars are won with Excel spreadsheets. And what drones has done is really changed the balance when it comes to spending on quite a lot of these different fields. When you're looking at, let's say, a $20,000 drone launched from Yemen against a very expensive ship that requires a very expensive missile to take that out, how is this absolute difference of cost affecting how armed forces are deploying their air defense materials? And is it forcing people to really spread themselves thin to try and counter these problems?
Well, we have to caveat the success of these cheap drones and acknowledge that a lot depends on the pilot skill. A lot depends on pilot training. Most successful drone pilots, like the ones in Ukraine, can actually strike many adversary targets. The same goes for the Russians. Their best pilots are also wreaking havoc on Ukrainian logistics and supplies. Radio-controlled FPV drones make up the bulk of drone forces in Ukraine combat. The failure rate is fairly high. It is a lot less for fiber-optic controlled UAVs, but that's because there are fewer fiber-optic drones out there. I think the issue we have to consider is how the forces are investing in UAV capabilities, positioning these UAV forces and technologies to target whatever they think is most important. But again, I think we come back to the pilot skill as probably the most important element in the war in Ukraine, which is why both Ukrainian and Russian militaries are prioritizing going after adversaries' drone pilots as the number one issue in this war.
So, Tom, you were talking about comparing the Russians and the Ukrainians and how they're using their drones. Can you give us a bit of an insight on how both sides are using their drones at a tactical level, as well as how both sides are trying to counter the drones?
Sure. In early 2024, Ukraine and Russia got locked into this kind of arms race. I call it the reverse Manhattan Project because it was an all-encompassing military endeavor to invest everything they could in military technology for its success on the battlefield. However, it was the opposite of the Manhattan Project trying to build the atomic bomb. Rather than one big weapon, it was trying to build as many tiny, cheap, fast, maneuverable weapons as possible, and then scale that production astronomically. I think the Ukrainians have said that this year they're on pace to build up to 4 million drones. So I think one of the first things that happened is it was actually the Ukrainians during that period of desperate need who really started innovating with the importation of a lot of cheap components from China to make those drones. A lot of those drones are being put together in people's houses, basements. It's really amazing how Ukraine has come together in this whole of society effort. However, quite quickly, people learned that these drones had a significant weakness, was that because they relied on an uninterrupted signal between the operator and the drone, that signal could be tampered with, it could be cut off, it could be intercepted. People started making drone detection mechanisms and electronic warfare capabilities to figure out the frequency of the drone and hijack that frequency to either take control of the drone or cut the connection between the drone and the operator. One of the things that happened, and this was actually more of a Russian innovation than a Ukrainian innovation, was the realization that if you have a physical cable, a thread, that can't be cut with electronic warfare. One of the major innovations on the battlefield now, and it's still a minority, but those numbers are climbing steeply, are the drones that are using tiny fiber optic cables. Now, there's some really terrifying photos from near the front lines in Donetsk region where you basically see these fields that kind of glisten, not because they've got dew on the grass, but because the entire field is covered with tiny spools of fiber optic FPV cables. Now people are trying to work out, well, what's the best way to combat those? They can be anything from machine guns. A lot of people are driving around literally with shotguns in their car because a shotgun is considered the thing that can kind of get the most bang for your buck in taking down a drone. Others are thinking of drones that will intercept the drones in orbit. I actually went to a really interesting conference last year. It was called Brave One in Kiev, and it was full of this sort of startup situation where basically there are loads of people showing off the demos that they had for their drones and asking for investment. I think one other point that's crucial to make is it has made the battlefield much more dangerous. One of the biggest problems now is the rotation of troops. Troops can sometimes be stuck on the zero line for weeks, even months, simply because the most dangerous part is getting them and supplies to the zero line and then taking them back. People are using unmanned ground vehicles to drive to frontline positions and drop off supplies. But especially for infantry, this war is getting more and more lethal, and both sides is kind of locked in this back and forth chess match.
So, Candace, I'm going to go to you on this one. One of the big things we've seen is not only pilot skill, but also the availability of these drones. If you look at somewhere like the Central African Republic, whilst you might have Wagner be able to use them, it's not always guaranteed the local forces might have them. If they're still relying on foreign contractors and mercenaries to do that for them, how self-sufficient are some of these local militaries? And does that mean if they are becoming reliant on drones, that they're going to become even more reliant on the supplying countries going forward?
Yeah, that's a great question. It obviously varies by country. Central African Republic is a place where Russia and Wagner forces have a much freer hand to operate. There's actually deeper dependencies that kind of stretch back to their first insertion in late 2017 or early 2018. that were baked into the relationship with local forces. The use of drones in that theater actually is relatively limited, certainly for strike capacity. Some of that has to do with terrain, some of that has to do with just the nature of the war itself there and the conflict there, and the numbers of different individual rebel forces at work. I think there is a risk for other countries like Mali, where Russian forces under the aegis of Africa Corps have been incredibly important for augmenting the capacity of Malian local forces to combat rebel forces in the field. But actually, I think there is some indication that Mali is not particularly happy with the relationship. We've seen Simi Goita, the chief of the military junta in Mali, travel to Moscow relatively recently. There is some suggestion that there is an ask for more native capacity to not only produce and deploy drones and other types of augmented military equipment. But I think we're going to start to see more demand for independence in certain countries. So in Sudan, we've seen the RSF, the Rapid Support Forces, closely allied with Russia, act aggressively using drones. And that's been going on for quite some time. They've learned a lot from the Russians. There is some degree of dependency, but it's all about the money. These situations in Africa, you have intermediaries or sponsors like the UAE as potential competitors, particularly in Sudan. What we've seen is a change in circumstances where Sudan and the UAE and Russia were closely allied. Now, with the civil war still ongoing, we've seen a split between Russia and the UAE, and that could have meaningful impact on local drone deployment and production in the region.
So, Sam, I'm going to throw you under the bus and make you give the counter narrative here, even though you're an expert on drones. I do see it far too often on Twitter and a few other places that now that we have drones, well, tanks are useless and there's no use for an F-35 program anymore, and drones will do everything. Can you maybe take us through why that might not actually be the case?
This is probably one of a dozen or so discussions that I participated in where we basically say, have we come to bury a tank or to praise it? We have to acknowledge that while some tanks have proven very vulnerable to FPVs and other types of drones, there's still no substitute for that particular vehicle in combat. A well-defended tank, a well-protected tank, a tank that is used in combination with other forces can be quite lethal. The same goes for expensive aircraft programs. Even long-range UAVs cannot perform the functions of an expensive fighter jet. No drone can carry as many explosives, as many munitions as a modern combat aircraft. Modern aircraft were not designed for tactical operations. They're not designed to operate in the airspace below 3,000 feet or even 2,000 feet, where a lot of tactical drones are operating right now. So there's a place for larger, more sophisticated platforms out there. And now we are finding out that there's a lot of space, importance for smaller, attritable, cheap systems as well. Now, are tanks and expensive aircraft going to be vulnerable to the ever advancing nature of different types of one-way attack drones? Possibly, yes, but it's all about how these systems are used and in combination with what forces and weapons.
Tom, in addition to covering Ukraine, you covered the Karabakh War and Armenia, Azerbaijan for a while as well. That conflict did see drones used, and that did shock a lot of people with how successful the Azeris were able to use those. What are the big differences between how you saw drones used back then to how they're being used today?
Okay, so yes, that's a very good comparison point. I'll lay out first where the similarities are. The similarities are both tactical and actually aesthetic. A lot of people were referring to the Karabakh War as sort of the first video game war because it's a bunch of guys sitting in a room. A lot of them have energy drinks and snacks, shooting at stuff on a screen. It didn't look the same in Ukraine when I visited drone outposts there. One of the main differences in the Karabakh War was the type of drone employed. The main drones there were the Israeli Harop drone and the quite famous Bayraktar TB2. Now, the Bayraktar TB2 was sort of I'm simplifying a lot here, but a bit of a cheap knockoff of Reapers and Predator drones. The Armenians were missing a crucial, what we now know is an absolutely crucial component of any military that's going to fight a sustained war, which is good short-range air defense systems, or at least those in sufficient quantities to take them out. Now, the Russians, with a bigger military, were able to bring those systems when their troops were advancing. And so while Ukraine got a lot of early kills, they were knocked out fairly quickly. And after about a month, you didn't hear much about them anymore. In fact, I haven't seen a sighting of them on the battlefield since 2022. I might be wrong about that. What this whole process in Ukraine has been making smaller drones, usually smaller and often cheaper drones, so that the drones themselves will be more numerous than any of the countermeasures the Russians can have against it. This is to do more with tactical battlefield drones. It's a very different story when we're talking about long-range strike drones, which are what the Ukrainians are trying to use to overcome the deficit of long-range missiles that they have.
So, Candace, one of the biggest developments we've seen in drones is the fact that they are cheap enough that an entire new category of countries are able to get access to an air force. If you look at Africa, for instance, usually you'd expect the only people who really have air assets or jets would be like South Africa, Nigeria, Morocco, Algeria, Egypt, the bigger players in the region. Whereas with drones, we're seeing guys like Rwanda, Burkina Faso, much smaller powers having access to air power now. What do you think this is doing to the fighting ability of these smaller countries?
Yeah, well, one thing that we've seen is the proliferation of native drone production capacity. Nigeria is a great example, South Africa, Ethiopia. These are countries that now have their own capacity to develop their own drones and deploy them. I think Ethiopia is actually a very good example where you might have a parallel with Ukraine. There is a territorial divide, a sharp line where the front is well defined, and the use of drones can be quite useful in targeting operations. It gives power to extend the range of military forces in what is essentially a territorial contest. In other places, like Central African Republic, I might mention, right? There you have guerrilla warfare tactics being employed, and drones, while useful for tight regional conflagrations, maybe not so useful in the larger context of an enabling mechanism for the local military. Certainly, in none of these situations can drones replace the capacity of a strategic air force with jet fighters. However, what I think you can see is an increasing number of strikes means more casualties and more fatalities. And that really can exacerbate and lengthen the nature and term of a conflict, as we've seen in many different cases. And it may make it difficult to rein in forces that may challenge local governments in a given situation. The challenge for places across Africa is less about dependency and more about the ability to rein in the effects of drones in theater when they're available for rebel forces or other types of forces. It can be a real game changer and challenges the long-term stability of these states.
So, Sam, Tom was talking earlier about drones still attached to fiber optic cable, but what happens when we start to get fully autonomous drones becoming the standard rather than the special case?
A lot depends on how these drones are trained for combat. A lot depends on data sets that go into training UAVs to recognize specific targets and terrain. That in turn leads to the modification of existing tactics, especially ground force tactics, how they can counter these type of autonomous UAVs. We are now getting into swarming applications for drones. A lot of videos out there that show thousands of UAVs operating in unison. That's pre-programmed performance, and it's quite impressive, but it's not really applicable for a complex battlefield like Ukraine. You need to train your drone to operate in a very complicated environment with countermeasures. So a lot of efforts right now in Ukraine and Russia, and probably elsewhere as well, are put into training these UAVs to operate in that type of environment. It's training data sets, the ability to recognize targets and lock on and continue to targets in an environment brimming with anything and everything that's trying to shoot down this drone.
So, Tom, part of what you talked about was the kind of cat and mouse game we are seeing where Ukraine comes up with a new drone innovation, Russia figures out a way to counter it, then Russia will do the same thing back to Ukraine. Can you take us through some of these cat and mouse games we are seeing and how quickly both sides can innovate when the other side brings something new to the battlefield?
Okay, so the major one that I mentioned was electronic warfare, which my countermeasure for it became fibre-optic drones. Now one of the big things is to figure out how to kinetically destroy or block fibre-optic drones. Another thing is you'll see a lot of places in Donetsk region in Ukraine now are covered in netting because it's considered the only way to stop drones from flying onto roads or supply routes. How practical it's going to be to cover the entire logistics chain with netting is another thing. But there are also ways in which drones have replaced traditional munitions in ways that you might not be originally expected. So, for instance, one thing that happened in Kursk a few times that soldiers were reporting is that drones would be used as mines. They'd be left in a hole on the side of the road, and a vehicle comes, and when the operator is alerted that a vehicle is near, all of a sudden the drone jumps and smashes itself right onto the incoming vehicle. That was a very major one that people have described lately. But I think the other innovation worth going into again is ways to make the battlefield more survivable in ways that mean you don't have to maneuver as much. So a lot of that has become about getting logistics chains organized so that you can automate logistics with ground vehicles and sort of almost ammo drops once again that you might see in a video game. Instead of a loot package being dropped on soldiers in a foxhole so they don't have to move around as much. A lot of people are trying to move as much of the activities as possible underground. So a lot of field hospitals, whereas once they might have just been in an unmarked building, they're now in a fairly deep basement so that, you know, that the drone basically just can't follow an ambulance in and sneak into the field hospital itself. One of the other big innovations I was talking about are drones being used at sea. Drones at sea have been one of the major things that have taken out Russia's control of the Black Sea. I think one of the great ironies of the war is that the war was in large part started so that Russia could firm up its control over Crimea and Ukraine would never be able to attack it by land. Well, Ukraine has effectively made it inoperable as a byproduct of the war. These kind of cat and mouse games are just going on.
So, Candace, we are seeing some countries who are starting to ban drones, particularly countries like Syria, Madagascar, even Iran's tried to ban drones. But from your opinion, now that drones are out there, is there a way that countries can actually clamp down fully?
No, I mean, we are not going to see some sort of weaponized ban on drones, attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure. That is obviously a concern, but I think it's too late now, especially because we're not done yet with all of the innovation that's happening on the Ukrainian battlefield. Operation Spiderweb alone tells us that we're not done yet with the kind of innovations that we've seen there. And that is going to be very tempting for a lot of other countries that are looking at Ukraine as both a futures lab and a sort of litmus test for how to innovate in this area of deployment and production. So unfortunately, no change there. Where there might be some progress is on AI enabled drones that help the capacity for targeting. That may be an area where there could be some progress, but the technology is moving so fast that many institutions like the UN are just not well positioned to move with the agility necessary to get ahead of the challenges that these drones pose.
We're going to start to wrap things up because I know we're running short on time here. But Sam, what do you think will be the biggest innovation going forward? You know, what is the headline you'd read that no, we are in the next generation of drones from where we are now?
I think it's actual AI-enabled swarms that were launched against specific targets and completely overwhelmed and destroyed them. I think once we start talking about intelligent swarms, not pre-programmed swarms or where each drone in a group is controlled by its own pilot, once we talk about intelligent drones that can share information between them as they approach the target, those that can modify their flight, we're actually going to be crossing a very different threshold in combat. And again, Ukraine promised that in 2025 we will see them field these type of swarms. Russia is investing in it. A lot of militaries around the world are working on it. They can either launch small groups of UAVs in a controlled setting, or the actual technical solution so far eludes them. Everybody's inching closer to that, and I think that's going to be a significant improvement in combat in general.
Tom, what do you think the biggest innovation for drones going forward will be for the tactical perspective on the battlefield? What's the headline you're looking for?
It's not so much a headline I'm looking for, it's what I've already seen. And it's the total ubiquity of access to drones. A drone in Ukraine, it's quite difficult to overstate how easy it is if you're a Ukrainian to get the components that you need to assemble a drone and get the sort of the munitions and the ammunition that you need. You need tiny propellers, tiny camera, and strong enough sticks of plastic or wood to make a munition to put on the drone. This is not specialized equipment. I spoke to one soldier who ran out of shell casings to use on a drone, so he used a Pringles can to pack explosives into it, and it worked. And I think this has deeper implications because what it means is that any militia or military in the world is going to be able to use these drones very cheaply and quickly. So I think what I've seen in warehouses and backyards across Ukraine, that's the real headline for me.
So, Candace, I'll let you have the last word here. What do you think the big innovation for drones will be in some of the developing countries? What's the headline you're looking for?
I think there are three developments we might look for, and some of them are already occurring. One thing we need to mention is that this year, Russia is starting to bring online its own UAV force. A separate branch of the military will have unmanned vehicle capacity distributed across all of the services. Right now, that's a good indication that Russia understands this is a fixed part of warfare for the near term. It's worth investing in creating kind of the doctrinal platform for the distribution of these forces, deployment of these forces, growing that expertise so that more and more parts of the military can take on that capacity. We're going to see that kind of innovation on an organizational level in many other countries. We may see it in Africa, but I'll probably see it even more in the Middle East, where we've already seen in the Israel-Iran theater a lot of interesting uses of drones, and also in Gaza. That kind of organizational innovation is going to be one thing to be looking out for because it will be a game changer. The second thing we might look for is innovations in material science. We've already seen that with Shahed drones in the context of Ukraine. The Russians have found that upgrading their materials, the type of metals and so forth that are used for their wings, for the nose, have been important for the deterrent effect against electronic warfare. And that brings me to the last innovation. I think we're going to see a lot more innovation in terms of growing the capacity for drones to elude electronic warfare. There may be other innovations that we'll see that have to do both with AI and eventually, not now, maybe 10 years from now, some sort of quantum-enabled innovations as well.
So I cannot thank my panelists enough for jumping on today to talk a bit about drones. I recommend everybody check out their work. Sam has done amazing pieces on flying drones as well as UGVs and UUVs, and is pretty much my go-to guy for what's going on in the world of drones. Candace has written an amazing book, Putin's Sledgehammer, and has done great analysis. And Tom's new book, The Dogs of Mariupol, is also fantastic if you want great battlefield stories that will give you a better idea on what's going on the ground. So to all three, I cannot thank you for jumping on this one enough, and thanks for tuning in.